Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. My name is Suzanne Loftus, and I have with me on the show today, Michael Kimmage. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So Michael Kimmage is a professor of history at the Catholic University of America, specializing in the history of the United States, Europe, and Russia. And he's written a fascinating book called The Abandonment of the West, The History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy. So let's start with definitions. How would you define the West or Western civilization more broadly? Who is in the West, and has this changed over time?
Definitely. This is one of the world's most confusing terms, next to impossible to pin down. Sometimes you find contradictions in the definition of the West, even in the mind of a single person. So it's very plastic and it's very fluid. And so what I settled on for the book was a particular definition, which is only one of several options. And this was emphasis on liberty and self-government embedded in some kind of transatlantic narrative. And so you see this already in the 18th century. Thomas Jefferson, who speaks of a ball of liberty rolling forward from the American Revolution. It's certainly there with Woodrow Wilson and really most 20th and 21st century US presidents. And we can debate how sincere or genuine the commitment is to this narrative, but that's what I stick with. And I think it's a pretty good working definition, certainly for US foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And, you touched upon it very briefly, but who were the iconic presidents that represented a true idea of the West in US foreign policy, and why?
Right. Well, sure. You don't get the use of the word the West for the most part until the late 19th, early 20th century. So when it comes to just a vocabulary and grammar of the West, it's largely a 20th century phenomenon. Woodrow Wilson, to my mind, although he embodies what I define as the West in many ways, I don't think that he used the term very much. It's a term that comes into its own in the 1920s and 1930s, and the West starts to get defined in the United States against Nazi Germany on the one hand, and the Soviet Union on the other. Where the term really prospers is in the early Cold War, because they are very definitive. You have an East and a West, you have an East and West Germany, East and West Berlin, and the East is defined as communist, authoritarian, hostile to the free market, hostile to individual liberty. And the West, this could be NATO, this could be the Transatlantic Alliance, it could be the United States. The West is defined as the antithesis, as committed to basic fundamental freedoms, political pluralism, self-government, et cetera. So it's a political definition, it's a political distinction. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, for sure. It's also a geopolitical distinction that's important for foreign policy. And the West is spoken about in detail by Lyndon Johnson, by Richard Nixon, maybe a little bit less by Jimmy Carter, certainly by Ronald Reagan. And then when the Cold War comes to an end, it's something of a different story. But Truman to Reagan, really all of the Cold War presidents are pretty committed to the West.
Mm-hmm. And then, when the Cold War ended, when did Germany fully enter the West, and how did this fit into the American-led strategy for Europe?
Well, this is a big debate in Germany itself. One of the most important histories of Germany by a historian by the name of Heinrich Winkler is called The Long Road to the West, Lange Weg nach Westen. And, the assumption there, which is actually pretty similar to American thinking, is that Germany joins the West in the 1940s, or at least West Germany does. When it becomes a democracy, it becomes part of the NATO alliance in the 1950s, and a partner in the Cold War struggle on the one hand. That's very important to American definitions of the West in the second half of the 20th century. But Germany also is committed to, in the eyes of US policymakers, is committed to a Western political project. When Germany ceases to be fascistic, when it ceases to be Nazi Germany and becomes the democratic West Germany that will change over time into just Germany proper after reunification. But it's the 1940s that you see that transition. Prior to that, Germany was, of course, quite a considerable enemy of the United States, First and Second World War. A little bit confusing because it's in the middle of Europe and in many ways in the Western part of Europe, but not part of the West. Until 1945 or 1950, 1955 or so.
Okay, and what about the foundation of NATO? So you said in your book that a military without a civilizational alliance would unravel, and only the two together could thrive. Why is this the case?
Right. Well, I think that military partnerships in the face of a common enemy can be quite strong. That can be the connecting link. We see some of that in the last couple of months in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that the sort of military anxiety that has caused in Germany and other places has strengthened the NATO alliance. But I think that even that takes you only so far. You need a story to tell about a military alliance. You need a sense of affinity, friendship, connection. That just doesn't come out of nowhere. That comes from a shared sense of the past. It may be an imagined past, but that's important too. It comes from a shared sense of commitment to certain principles and values. In short, it comes from a kind of cultural proximity. And I think that that's a strengthening aspect of military alliances. And that's what I mean by civilizational, that there's some sort of larger cultural vision that's there and that unites countries and makes the bond stronger, because it's that really allows countries to sacrifice for one another, which is an important part of a military alliance. If it's just interests, I think it's only half the battle.
And just, as a side note to this question, do you believe that, all the members in NATO are part of one civilization?
Probably not. And there are different degrees of definition and different degrees of commitment. How Poland defines the Polish government, how it defines culture at the moment is not the same as the way France does or the United States. There are gradations and differences and, tensions often, and those are significant. But if there is a core commitment to what we could describe as certain civilizational principles, that's enough. They don't need to be identical, but there has to be that core commitment. And I think for the time being, summer of 2022, NATO is pretty healthy in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And so, in light of this discussion, how did enlargement fit into this narrative? Were the Marshall Plan and NATO civilizational duties at all? And what is the limit of this idea without becoming part of this liberal technocratic world order you speak of in your book?
Right. Well, it certainly was a civilizational project for the architects, the West, the NATO alliance, even the EU, the Marshall Plan. For the creators of it, my focus is on the American creators of it. The story might be a bit different in Europe, but for George Marshall, George Kennan, Dean Acheson, Truman, and others, there's a very consistent, sort of rich documentary legacy of their thinking about the West, and that was of a piece with their concern for European security and the commercial economic bonds between Europe and the United States. But again and again, you see figures who justify the commitment to the NATO alliance as a commitment to the West and as a civilizational commitment. That was very typically the language, political language of the 1940s and 50s. So George Marshall, for example, goes to the US Congress and says, we need to build up NATO, we need to build up our connection to Europe because Western civilization is in peril. So that was standard language, and that's very, very important, I would say, to the early history of both NATO and the overall US commitment to Europe. I think after 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's of course the passage of a lot of time. So some of that East-West distinction becomes less meaningful. Europe opens up, it becomes larger. And in the absence of a real enemy, I think foreign affairs became, in the 1990s and afterwards, fairly technocratic. And so you see, I'm thinking here of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, maybe a little bit more than George W. Bush. And I think Trump takes things in a different direction. But for Clinton and Obama, there are these systemic justifications for the enlargement of NATO. It's sort of good for the global economy. It's good for democracy in Europe. It's going to bring us greater peace and prosperity, but you don't see in those two figures, Clinton is the one who really matters because he's the person who really promotes enlargement of NATO. There's not a civilizational argument. It's just for the good of the world in a certain sense. And so it's a different foundation from what you see in the 40s and 50s.
And so when did this idea of the West that you described, when did it begin to fragment?
So for me, the key transition, and I try to chart this in the book, is the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I think it's a two-part process that both the left and right have new reasons in the 60s and 70s to be critical or skeptical of the West. What's very important for the early history of, say, the US commitment to NATO is that it's bipartisan. So it's FDR and Truman as Democrats, and then Eisenhower comes in 1952, and Eisenhower has some different emphases when it comes to foreign policy, but he's really committed to the same sort of transatlantic vision. I think on the right, starting in the 60s, there's a concern that sort of liberal technocratic views are sort of incompatible with civilization, have become superseded, or civilizational visions have become superseded by something that's bland, atheistic, technocratic, etc. I focus here on the book by James Burnham, a very interesting 1964 book in which he describes the suicide of the West. That's the title of the book. And for him, that's sort of the United States of John F. Kennedy. Too committed to the third world, too internationalist, too technocratic. And I think that's a thread or a sort of line of argument that's picked up later by Pat Buchanan and given something of a more populist emphasis by Buchanan and has a lot of popular currency on the right in the contemporary United States. Meanwhile, on the left, there's a very different critique of the West that comes into play. And this is the West as a synonym for white supremacy, for empire, and for racism. And here I focus 1978 book by Edward Said, a Columbia University professor who looked at the heritage of empire in Europe and applied it to the United States after the Second World War, and was very critical of Western orientation in American foreign policy from that standpoint. So you see less of a bipartisan commitment over time and more incentives or reasons on both the left and the right side of the political spectrum to be critical of the Western consensus that's pretty strong for the first 2-3 decades of the Cold War.
Yeah, and you mentioned Edward Said, his famous Orientalism. So how exactly did that affect the narrative, Western civilization narratives among the intellectual?
Well, quite profoundly, because one of the trends I try to document in the book in a very big picture way is that in the first half of the 20th century, you have an academic world that's really building up this idea of Western civilization. Starts first at Columbia University with their Western Civ curriculum, and really spreads throughout American academia. University of Chicago, Stanford, most universities kind of sign on in the 20s, 30s, or shortly thereafter to these Western Civ curricula that are celebratory. This is who we are as Americans. We're a part of the West. We have this civilizational heritage. We need to carry it on. We need to instill it in the next generation. It's good for our foreign policy. It's good for our culture. It's good for our society to be of the West. That's, a sort of, I think, defensible generalization about the first half of the 20th century. Second half is just very different. Western civilization is much more questioned. There's a lot more skepticism, especially in academic circles. I think Edward Said's book is a kind of early opening salvo in those debates. We have what's described as the culture wars. And there's just a much stronger tendency by the second half of the 20th century, 1980s, 1990s, and then into the 21st century to look at the West as something that's ugly or old-fashioned, connected to patriarchy, connected to those things that need to be overcome in our country, our society. To be multicultural, you have to be less Western. I think that's a common argument in academic circles, and that just takes you to a different place from where the country was in the first half of the 20th century.
And so is this why universities stopped teaching Western civilization programs, or are there other reasons?
I think universities haven't fully stopped. You still have a couple like Columbia where that commitment is still formally on the books. You have St. John's College in Annapolis that's very dedicated to a Western Civ curriculum. My home university, Catholic University, has quite a few commitments in that regard. But it's certainly a lot less fashionable than it was. But it is the reason, among others. Sort of certain ideas. I think the new ideal becomes much more a multicultural ideal after the 1970s, and the West can be there. Certainly Europe is going to be important. Ancient languages, antiquity. It's not that universities have taken these out of circulation. It's just that they have less prestige than they once had. And there are many, many other commitments that the American university world has. American university world has also become a lot more global in the last 40, 50 years. Much more knowledge about Asia and Africa, the Middle East, than there was before. That I think is a very good trend. And Europe has been put more in context.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the 60s and the 70s a lot when you start discussing about how the West began to fragment. So I'm thinking Vietnam War. How did that affect the idea of the West? I mean, there was a civil rights movement in the United States. There was, this anti-colonialism in country versus colonialism out country. Reputation suffered. Would you expand on those ideas?
Yeah, no, I think the Vietnam War, so many roads in contemporary America go back to the Vietnam War. It's such a sea change in the country's perception of the world and the country's perception of itself. This happens, I think, more on the left side of the political spectrum, but there is just a loss of faith in American foreign policies, a loss of faith in the American reading and interpretation of the Cold War. It's us, them, perhaps, but I think no longer after Vietnam or during Vietnam was the we or the us necessarily the good guys. I think it acquired a very different set of connotations, and the sense in which the Vietnam War was interpreted as an imperial war is very important on the left. I talk about Martin Luther King and some of the lectures and speeches he gave on Vietnam, and he makes those connections between racism within American society and the way in which the US was conducting itself in Vietnam. So there you have a very profound challenge to the sense that the US is Western and therefore the US is a good country. That really is destabilized, certainly during the Vietnam War. And it's important to fit this into a larger set of patterns, that you have a huge wave of decolonization that's going on from 1945, say, to 1975. US is it's very complicated how the US is positioned in that pattern of decolonization, but there's just a lot more criticism because of Vietnam. And there's this sense, Noam Chomsky and others, critics of the United States on the far left, who start to look at the US as an empire. So if the West is defined as a commitment to liberty and self-government, and the United States has become an empire, that's of course a real problem. So all of those criticisms are put forward with a lot of vigor in the 1960s, and they just reverberate in many ways down to the present day. The story on the right side of the political spectrum is different, but if you want to look at criticism in Vietnam, that's a story of the political left for the most part.
Mm-hmm. And so what about today? What challenges do China and Russia represent to the West?
I think that we are going back in many ways to the world of the Cold War. There are differences in technology. The Chinese economy is robust in ways that could never have been imagined during the Cold War. I think Russia is in some ways more disruptive than the Soviet Union was, especially in Europe. So there are differences, but either ironically or not so ironically, the fundamental differences are really quite similar. And I wonder if you can't draw a parallel here between Biden and Truman in some ways in terms of the challenges that they face. So it's not just that Russia imperils the national security of a host of European countries, or perhaps the national security of the United States, and that therefore NATO has to be strengthened and there has to be greater defense spending and a real response has to be mustered to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's of course true, but it's only half the story. I think it's impossible to look at Ukraine and not to see that this is a country that's a democracy, that's engaged in the work of self-government, and that is committed, at times imperfectly, but committed to the idea of political liberty. And it's impossible not to see the Russian invasion as an effort to snuff that out. And so in a way, the very core question of the West, as I try to raise it in the book, going back to the 18th century, this narrative of liberty and self-government embedded in a transatlantic story, there's no place in which that is more poignant at the moment than in Ukraine. And the only way that you can explain, I won't speak for Germany here, I'll just speak for the US, the huge outpouring of sympathy for Ukraine in the United States since the beginning of the war in February 2022. War is older, but it intensifies in February 2022. The only way that you can explain that is by this long-standing and quite traditional commitment that Americans have to the West. So if I describe the abandonment of the West in the title of my book, I think what you have to say, or what I have to say as the author of the book, is that it's been quite a partial abandonment, because you can see such a strong reinvigoration of this tradition at the present moment.
Mm-hmm. And so, as you argue, throughout the 20th century, many Americans saw themselves as part of a Western civilization and of these ideals that you describe. But today, we're in between other ideas, one which you've already described, the technocratic liberal international order. And on the other side, you have an illiberal nationalism of America first. So, what are these ideas and how did they lead to the, partial abandonment of the West? And how do you suggest to solve this issue so that we can restore the West?
Right. Well, let me say a little bit more about the illiberal part of the story. These are contested interpretations to be sure, but I left a thread with Patrick Buchanan, who emphasizes a strong sense of American nationhood, and he worries about technocratic liberal internationalism. He sees himself as a very strong defender of the West, but it's a sort of ethno-nationalist West. There is an element of whiteness in it, sort of indigenous Europeanness, and there's a sense in which Islam is a sort of threat, immigration is a threat, and there's a need through foreign policy to retain a certain kind of ethnic purity. That's not exactly Donald Trump. I mean, it is and it isn't in the politics, domestic politics and foreign policy of Donald Trump, but on a lot of issues, sort of immigration, commitment to NATO, commitment to Europe, you see a new story that's being told by Donald Trump that's much more skeptical of this narrative of liberty and self-government that had been there powerfully in effect at the beginning of the Cold War. Donald Trump has a lot of political allies in Eastern and Central Europe. So the government of Poland and the government of Hungary, you just had the CPAC, the sort of conservative meeting of American conservatives in Hungary, that there's a certain concordance of view that civilization is Christian and it's about tradition, and there are some groups of people who are more a part of it than others. This has powerful purchase, and a lot of these people define themselves, as Donald Trump does, as defenders of the West. It's just a different vision or view of the West. And the technocratic view of liberal international order is, in many ways, I find compelling and interesting, but it's a little bit bloodless, and it sort of lacks any kind of cultural profile. So I would argue for a sort of renewal of the idea of the West. Let's make sure that it's as multicultural as possible, that it's imbued with the ideal of tolerance. It's open to anybody who wishes to be a part of it. There's sort of no barriers of entry, but at the same time, a view of the West that keeps the best of the tradition, that sort of anchors the West in some notion. We could call it liberal democracy. We could call it liberty, self-government. I sort of don't use the word democracy in the book because I feel it's a very hard one to define. In addition to the West, I think liberty and self-government for me are a little bit more tangible. And in the American case, this is probably the hardest part of the problem at the moment. To succeed, this is going to have to be bipartisan. It can't just be the work of Republicans and it can't just be the work of Democrats. It's got to be the work of both parties. So let's draw on tradition a bit. Let's draw on the relevant history. Let's keep an eye to the future. Let's remember that the US has partnerships across the world, in Asia, in the Middle East, where you probably wouldn't want to use a word like the West to define what the US is up to or committed to. Be flexible, be open, but at the same time, keep that which was best about this tradition and apply it to the sort of crises and the conflicts of the 21st century. I think, going back to what we said a moment ago about Ukraine and Russia, it actually fits pretty well to the challenges of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. And, more on that a little bit. So Trump's illiberalism, at the same time, there is this idea of, who are we originally? And let's emphasize this identity, but let's not get involved internationally too much. Whereas the liberal, technocratic order is more, let's be imposing internationally, but what's our identity? It's not so clear. So in a way, you're saying to kind of combine the two in a way where we're continuously involved abroad as much as possible, but through the lens of more of a Western identity? Or how much do you suggest being involved or interfering or cooperating in other countries?
I'll skip over the word identity. I don't think that I would want to have too much of that in foreign policy. I think it's more telling a story, that you can tell a story in which, among other things, the West is the protagonist. And I think it's helpful. So for me, the gold standard is 1963, in the summer of 1963, when John F. Kennedy goes to Berlin. Gives a very short speech there at the Berlin Wall, 300-400 words. It's very, very well received by his German audience. And I think in that speech, it's most remembered for the phrase, "Ich bin ein Berliner." But he also says in Latin, "Civis Romanus sum," a sort of citizen of the Roman Empire, kind of updates that for 1960s circumstances. But I think what Kennedy does very elegantly in that speech is not just say, we have X number of economic commitments to Germany and we need to have this number of missiles, and that's how the Cold War works. He does something much more vibrant and interesting. He tells a story, and that story does involve liberty and self-government in West Berlin, in West Germany, throughout Europe, back in the United States. And he does it with a kind of eloquence, and it's heartfelt. And I don't think that his audience would respond with that degree of enthusiasm if it were a technocratic speech. But it's not an identitarian creed either. He's not saying, we the Americans are here to kind of rescue you or save the day, or this is about American identity or German identity. It's, I think, a bit more abstract than that, which is helpful, but it's vivid enough to get his story across. So I think that's what we can learn from Kennedy. We don't repeat the same language. We're going to have different, sorts of crises, but storytelling in foreign policy is always important. And that's where the West comes in handy, but not as a marker or badge of identity so much.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for enlightening us. It was a very interesting book, and I would recommend it to anyone who wants to pick it up. So thanks again for joining us today, Michael. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks a million, Suzanne, for your questions, and thank you for the kind words about the book.
And to the audience, thanks again for tuning back in to Security in the 21st Century.